to be needed. And I'm delighted to have with us a fantastic panel, and we're going to at least assess what hands they can lend in order to participate in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I will introduce the panel very quickly. They're all, as I said, highly reputable, respected luminary in their respective fields. We are lucky to have as a substitute to the President of the Republic of Ghana, Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. He is Minister of Development and Planning. Thank you very much for joining us. We have Bill McGlashan, who is the founder and managing partner of TPG Growth. And we have Anne Finucane, who is the Vice Chairman of Bank of America and Chairman of the Board of Bank of America, Merrill Lynch Europe, Bank of America USA, and in charge of a particular portfolio that she will detail for us later. And we have Sunil Bharti Mittal, who is the chairman of Bharti Enterprises India, one of the largest telecommunication company in the world, and a member of the International Business Council, and currently still, although soon to finish his term, head of the International Chamber of Commerce. Now, I'm going to start with the High Representative of Ghana, Excellency, and I'm assuming that you are familiar with all the themes that I've just mentioned. You're familiar with the objectives, you're familiar with the fiscal distance that separates today's situation from 2030's attainable goals, and I hope you agree with me that all hands must be on deck, and that measures have to be taken by the countries themselves. Can you detail that for us? And what I'm particularly interested in is, how do you manage to reconcile the long and medium-term objectives and the short-term imperatives of the budget, the next election, or as Jean-Claude Juncker once famously put it, we know exactly what to do, but we don't know how to do it and be re-elected at the same time. Over to you.
I think I'm on, yeah. Thank you so very much. Actually, the President is still at the UNGA, and he asked me to come quickly to stand in for him. You know, what we are doing in Ghana is that in order for us, we know very well that the Millennium Sustainable Development Goals will be very expensive to handle, but at the same time, too, we've tried very much to ensure that we use the budgetary process to start kick it off. First of all, what we've done is that, you know, our coordinated program, that is the plan that we have developed in the country, really is embedded in that is the Sustainable Development Goals. And so an attempt to, you know, implement the budget is indirectly implementation of the SDGs. That is the way that we've looked at it in the short run, you know, using the budgetary allocations to do that over the short period. But in the long run, we know very well that it's not going to be very easy for us, because the finances, our fiscal space is just very little like that. And therefore, there's the need to increase the resource mobilization internally. And what we're trying to do internally is to ensure that, you know, just as we rightly said, our tax to GDP ratio is less than 20%, about 16, 17%. So we intend to move it further to about 20, 25%, so that we can have more resources for that.
What timing do you have for that? Because I think the medium term and the planning are important.
Yes, the shorter term will be the budget, but the medium term is within, you know, we have a mandate of 4 years, and we have to deliver within that 4 years. So our medium term is a 4-year period. Mm-hmm. And what we are doing is that, you know, within this 4-year period, we have already had about 1.5 of that. Within that period, we should be able to move our tax to GDP ratio to that level. And again, you know, we need to also expand the base, yep, the tax base, which we're trying to do now by a lot of our businesses are in the informal sector. So we need to formalize them by coming out with a way to identify where they are, so that they can also be brought into the tax net. So that is the way to broaden the base, and of course, to make taxation fairer for everybody. Some other taxes will have to be imposed. Especially, we've started with one that is about, taxing luxury vehicles that are imported into the country, about a certain cubic capacity, so that we can also draw those taxes into the thing. But even all that, we still feel that we cannot really achieve what we want to achieve under the Sustainable Development Goals, because the resources will still be very little. Yeah. So we may have to find other alternatives of generating resources to support, to augment what we have. And we are doing that, of course, everybody is turning to the private sector. Yes, we are also turning to the private sector using our policies. We have a special policy that we are referring to as one district, one factory, where we want to decentralize industrialization. So every district will have to have one factory where you use local raw materials, add value to them. But that will be done by the private sector, facilitated by government.
So the decisions are made at the district level?
Decisions for that actually emanate from the center, but it's actually the district people are involved in the process. Mm-hmm. So it is maybe trying to have a harmony between centralization and decentralization. Okay,
one more question. I understand what you're trying to do in terms of tax and fiscal space, and I think that's very, very laudable. By the way, Ghana was the first country to cut poverty in half when it reached the Millennium Development Goals. So when you put your mind to it, my goodness, the Ghanaians are really efficient. Sure. How do you, and then I will ask Bill to address the same topic from his perspective, how do you deal with the risk of poor governance / corruption risks when you multiply the levels of decisions and implementation with central decisions and then district levels being involved as well?
Yeah, corruption is a major problem that we face in the country. And we have, first of all, come out with an independent prosecutor who will actually prosecute, especially those who are involved in corrupt practices in government and in the public services. So we have that one. The law has been passed. We actually created the office, and they have started trying to ensure that those who have fall foul be prosecuted. But more importantly, to prevent it. So we have our procurement laws in place, and we have created a ministry in charge of procurement, who is to monitor what other ministries do in terms of their procurement processes. And more importantly, one major area where we think people are very corrupt, but at the same time to also affect our industrialization and our development process is the port. The revenues at the port. Under invoicing, a whole lot of other things that go on there, so that we don't really get what we need from the port. So what we are doing is that we've started to make it paperless, not to reduce the human intervention in actually between the importer and...
So technology plays a role in that? Technology plays a key role in that?
Very much so.
We have to remember that when I come to you, Sunil.
Very much so. We are trying to use that to remove the human interventions.
Right.
Which will enable us to minimize...
and do you apply transparency to a great length, particularly in relation to procurement? Is it visible to all? Yes.
The procurement law actually stipulates how you go about, doing the procurement, going through the procurement processes. So yes, very transparent. You have to advertise. You have to have a committee that looks at it. So all these processes are in place, and that is why what we want to do to really ensure that this pilferage in the public purse is actually under control.
Thank you very much. Bill, can you from that bounce a little bit to your area and your sort of different ways of developing capitalism in your investment?
Yeah, just to give a little bit of context related to this point specifically, to start, in addition to TPG Growth, I'm the co-founder of the RISE Fund, along with people like Ann, who's up here, Bono, Mo Ibrahim, who's very involved in corruption, Jeff Skoll and others, and through those...
Prevention of corruption.
Sorry, involved in preventing corruption. Very good catch. He would not have forgiven me that. He would not have forgiven me that error. Thank you, Ann. In the context of both the RISE Fund and our growth business, we invest in markets around the world that I'll leave unnamed, but have perfected the art of corruption in many respects. Interestingly, in the private sector, if you're outside of the realm of where government is involved, even in the context of those markets where corruption is a major problem, it often doesn't occur in private business. We're able to find great entrepreneurs that are building businesses, and often the transparency that prevents and retards corruption comes out of those very same entrepreneurs that are building businesses on the back of mobile telephony, Sunil's platform, on blockchain, on software as a service, cloud computing, AI, analytics, big data. So we're seeing tremendous progress, both developmentally in the effect it's having in these local markets, but also specifically around transparency and supporting good governance, what Mo Ibrahim is all about, transparency and governance. So if you looked at the ranking in the Ibrahim Index, you would intuitively say below sort of the top 10%, we shouldn't be investing given the governance dynamics inherent in these countries, but that's just not the case. You can find great businesses in countries that are clearly way down that list from a governance and transparency perspective that are doing business in an extraordinarily laudable way, building great businesses that are in fact aiding the journey toward transparency.
Can you describe how they go about it?
Well, it's different by company, but if we invest across education, healthcare, financial services, food and ag. An example in Nigeria, one of those countries I'd say is challenging in many ways, is a company called Cellulant that set out to develop a platform that could create a direct link between government aid, about $500 million a year in government subsidy for small stakeholder farmers, who represent, by the way, 75% of the world's poor are these small stakeholder farmers. Direct connect between that $500 million a year and 7 million farmers. Historically, that 500 million became 45 million by the time it got from the government to the intended small stakeholder farmer. They went out, and because they were concerned about surviving this journey, they hired 16,000 people, moved very quickly to build a platform based on blockchain that looks a lot like Aadhaar in India, a digital identity solution that allows those subsidies to be transported directly to the 7 million end farmers. They brought other value-add services, education, training, microloans, et cetera, to these farmers, and then ultimately built an offtake solution so that companies like General Mills could buy directly from those 7 million farmers. The net effect is a 30% uplift in household income, which in the context of these small stakeholder farmers is unbelievable. And this is all happening in a private context. So there's a blended government-private relationship there that becomes one that's transparent, that's additive, that's reinforcing, that's productive, and durable.
So the 500 million, was it 500 million?
$500 million a year.
So they resurfaced?
Well, it's back to the 500. And by the way, the 500 is now going directly to the farmer. We saw this with what's happened in India, with Nanda Nilekani's and the government's efforts around, again, digital identity. When you get rid of these kinds of platforms, which are really private sector driven technology adopted by government sector, have the potential to be completely transformative. And we're seeing that in education, we're seeing it in healthcare. So there is an opportunity using the innovation engine of capitalism when directed in a way that brings a moral lens to bear. There is an opportunity, if measured properly and if held accountable, to be transformative in all of these markets in a way that's frankly critical if we're going to get to the $30 trillion needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Right, okay.
I said a mouthful there.
And I'm going to come back to you about the integration and how private financing comes into play to structure and help and engineer investments. But because technology was mentioned so much, and before I will come back to you on your philanthropic role as well, tell us a little bit how you see technology playing that impact which Bill has just described, and how can we go further and do more?
You know, very clearly, I represent the developing world here. Some of the markets that I operate in sub-Saharan Africa, and even parts of India, are truly the places where SDGs have the true meaning. I mean, they are directed towards those very people that are there in abject poverty, without education, without clean water, without basic necessities that the world takes for granted. And I'm very happy that this panel is being set up and you're chairing it. A lot of money is required, 5 trillion to 7 trillion a year, out of which 60–70% is to be directed towards developing world. And the monies that are coming through are woefully inadequate compared to those numbers. The ODA just topped up at $160 billion, and doesn't seem to be a major urge for Western world or the countries that are rich to give more money into their program. So we'll have to find our own solutions. And when you come to our local solutions, domestic markets, there are few things that can be done. Redirecting subsidies. Prime Minister Modi asked all the rich people to give up subsidies that they receive on a variety of items, particularly one called out item was domestic gas. And millions, tens of millions of people have given up subsidies so they can be directed towards the poor. And more focused and programmed subsidies will be one way. We're raising some domestic bonds, green bonds, some of the blue bonds that are coming up in countries which are more fishery associated, are small capital pools that will come through. So what do you do when you have a target of SDGs to be met by 2030, and we're talking about big items, eradication of hunger, poverty, providing education, sanitation, clean water? There's a lot to be done, and money's not there. So this is where my other hat, I'm chairing the GSMA, which is the global telecom body, in addition to ICC, where I'm the honorary chair now. I think technology holds the key. Very clearly,
technology holds the key.
Because that can mitigate the absence of capital. The minister from Ghana talked about it. A physical touch to deliver all those services is impossible. So you have to digitize your economies, which most of the emerging markets thankfully are doing it. And my industry, the mobile industry, is the real, I would say, champion in providing that last mile connectivity to hundreds of millions of people in each country. In India, nearly 1 billion people are now connected. You put a smartphone in their hand, it's a powerful computer. It's now down to $50, so it's in the realm of affordability. And then you start to put fanciful stuff in that. 250,000 education apps are now sitting in the cloud for mobile phones, 250,000 apps. To build physical schools, which we all try to do as much as we can, is never going to be possible, especially by 2030. But it doesn't need to be done anymore. We can't have bank branches enough for financial inclusion. You don't need to do it anymore. Your little phone is a bank branch now. Financial inclusion, health bulletins, tertiary healthcare, secondary healthcare, education, a lot of stuff can now be delivered through mobile phones. And within that, we see, as you know, women are even more marginalized in our societies, where their access to technology is limited. And I'm glad the GSMA is spearheading the Connected Women program. I don't know whether the report has been launched today or will be launched during the day. Sometime during the day in the UN, they will be launching this report, Connected Women. All of us, mobile industry, Sigve Brekke is here from Telenor, I can spot him. Many of us who work in the developing markets are focusing on that as well. Put a phone in the hand of a woman, a man, poorest of the poor, connect them with massive amounts of data at very affordable prices. And then you start to see the magic of technology start to happen, innovation coming through. There are so many people out there building frugal innovations to provide all these services. I remain very hopeful. The only thing I would like to say here, especially since you meet a lot of leaders from my emerging world, telecom industry is taxed almost at par with tobacco.
Sorry, say that again.
telecom industry, mobile industry, taxes are at par with tobacco in most of the countries. If this is a platform to mitigate absence of money and accelerate the achievement of SDGs, why can't it be adopted as a vehicle to deliver precisely that? All we are saying is, just take care of our load that you put on the industry. We want no money. $500 billion will be invested in the next 5 years in building more mobile networks. More 4G networks, more 5G networks, it'll all come from private sector. We don't need any money. But for God's sake, don't tax us heavily. That's one demand we will have from the leaders like you who have a voice, who can talk to the leaders of various states, and that's what we'd like to deliver.
Well, I know that the granting of licenses is one moment when the Minister of Finance, and I was one of those, are sort of, you know, preparing for the big collection. So I hear what you say. I don't know how you substitute it, but it's a very valid point that you're making. And in your position and with the very significant portfolio that you manage with great wisdom and focused on development in particular, what special know-how brings a bank like Bank of America in order to integrate various sources of financing? It's RISE, for one, it's philanthropic money, it's private company, it's banks as well participating in that.
Right. So I think what we applied is to sort of the tenets of the financial industry, which is risk and reward. And for a commercial bank, if you're willing, what we learned several years ago, 10 years ago, was if we could apply what we were doing generally to the environment, which was then a risk, to be investing in renewables, wind, energy efficiency, solar, et cetera. What we found is if we could partner with others, we could reduce the risk, and we could agree on, shall we say, the margin. So in a case, so that we learned it through our environmental work. And 10 years ago, we made a $20 billion commitment, and I honestly was unsure of how we would ever do it. And within 3 years, we were done. So the business obviously began to accelerate. We then made later a $125 billion commitment, of which we were halfway through. But with it, we learned so much that we could apply in a broader spectrum, basically the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is, can you find other financial organizations, each of us with a different risk and a different reward profile? So in the case of what Bill is talking about, private equity obviously wants a higher reward, but they're willing to take a higher risk and they want a shorter time frame. A development bank will take from first loss. Philanthropy will take first loss. A commercial bank has a very long horizon, wants lower risk, but is willing to take quite a modest return. If you can pull that all together, and we have many projects that we have now subsequently done, whether it's a wind farm in the North Sea or 30,000 panels of solar in Spain or a land trust in parts of Africa, in each case it required philanthropy, a development bank, commercial banks, family offices of wealth, and private equity, all to join, each one of us with a different risk horizon, each one of us with a different expectation in terms of return, but all of us interested in outcome. What would be the outcome? So you were getting in for a certain reason, and then you're very eager to see an outcome. The environment is easier, but we've been able to do it with water, which is related, but we have helped stand up a water equity fund with water.org, which is Gary White and Matt Damon, who have raised $50 million. We were the first $5 million guarantee. And it is to give to create micro lending at the grassroots level to allow women, particularly women, but families, to have running water for businesses and families at a very low interest rate. They have a 97% return on this. It works. So we have just applied that, whether it's capital to women, continued with environment, affordable housing, water, etc. And the newer entrance into this in the private equity world makes it more attractive to more people. And if what Bill is doing through RISE Fund and a commercial bank, now we are talking to development banks, trying to take what we've been doing at the bank to scale with world-known brands, it's really made a difference. But the risk can only be mitigated if the governments are also participating, because otherwise we just can't get buy-in.
Okay, so packaging, catalyzing, addressing the various range of the risks and the returns. It's my all hands on deck that you are actually putting together. Does that result into a new financial kind of security or financing instrument that is a special category, or is it every time tailored to a project, to a country, to a category of countries?
Well, every time it's bespoke. However, I'd say that the mechanism of green bonds has been a pretty good proxy for what we could do. Right. And a green bond, for I'm sure many of you know, but it essentially is the same as a municipal bond. It is to underwrite something that has a green value to it. It can't be greenwashing because you must report on it. So you must demonstrate what it is. That has served as a pretty good proxy for other instruments that we can syndicate. So that's been kind of a breakthrough.
Right. And when you say we need the government, the Minister of Development and Planning is right here from Ghana. What do you need from him?
Well, I think Bill would say the same. What we need is some sense that when we're doing a project that, when we're bringing in investors, that what we've gotten them to agree to and what we say the return will be, that the government will not be so volatile as to displace all the plans we've made, which is very difficult to do because even today's government may be different than tomorrow's. So we're looking for mechanisms to, shall we say, smooth that out. And what Bill was talking about, and you were talking about earlier, Mr. Mittal, is the transparency of technology, of being able to go straight to the customer so that it's at least on record, really makes a difference.
Mr. Minister, it goes a little bit back to my initial question. How do you collapse the short, medium term into the long term and guarantee that those well-financed investments are comfortably settled in the country, irrespective of changes?
Yeah, I think, you know, that is where there seems to be some element of conflict between democracy and maybe financing. Because see,
I wasn't suggesting that all leaders should stay until the end of their life in their position. No.
So we have a 4-year mandate and there will be election by all means, something will change. So, and of course, as he rightly said, you know, it's very scary when new governments are coming in, especially in where I come from. But then I think what we can do is, in Ghana, what we are trying to do now is to really have a PPP arrangement, a law that is backed by Parliament. That is not actually something that it comes from the executive only, to ensure that there is some continuity once it goes through Parliament. And also, I mean, some of these businesses, the contracts and arrangements that we have with the private sector should all the time go through Parliament to ensure that there is a bipartisan support for it.
So you bring the opposition effectively into the fold and have them approve it.
And in Ghana we debate it a lot. It's actually, when you get there you hear as if we are fighting each other. But the point is that, you know, there has to be a process that will actually ensure that people, both sides of the aisle, actually buys into that. Once that is done, I think it reduces a little bit of the risk and involved in maybe government changing from one area to the other. But for me, what I have seen is that, you know, it depends also on the project itself. We have started a project, of course, that is not a commercial one as such, but we are trying to make a free senior high school education to everybody else. And the people are thinking that, oh, this government is the one that is introducing it, and it's likely that it may, when another government comes in, probably they'll change it. But what I usually tell them is that, you see, look, if the project is something that has no political color, If the project is something that, if you are building a road from A to B, I mean, it's not only this part of the party or the other part of the party that uses that road. So the nature of the project itself doesn't have to be political. It doesn't have to have political colors. Once that is removed from it, you know, continuity will not be denied. So I think it is the way that the project is perceived, and then, of course, the extent to which the process is transparent when you're putting it together. I know there are certain projects that went through a lot of high-profile institutions, but it wasn't transparent enough. And that thing is, it is actually not on the other side of the Atlantic, but it's also from other side too. And that one is something that we should look at it very carefully to ensure that, you know, when projects are put together, there is a transparency in the whole thing from both sides, and that this element of corrupt practices do not actually make. Once you have them in, new governments come in and they already want to change it. So I think the type of the project, the way that it is handled, and of course the fact that it goes through parliamentary process can ensure that there is some continuity in whatever that you are doing. And of course, I know this PPP arrangement, I'm also a little bit skeptical about that, because once, if it doesn't go to Parliament and it stays only with the executive, a private, public, and the public is only executive, there can be a problem. So it has to be, get a buy-in from the Parliament as well.
Bill, can I turn to you, because Anne mentioned the risk-reward, risk-return. I know that you have very precise ideas about how to measure and how to determine what's a good project and what can actually be financed with success.
So what we're trying to pioneer, and it took years of work to do this in partnership with a lot of institutions, universities, impact players around the world, foundations and others, to do, Bridgespan being part of this effort from the beginning as well, was figure out if there was a way to actually measure impact, so that when we talk about returns, we're no longer as a society just simply focused on risk return, which is the traditional metrics that we in the investing world think about, but instead looking at risk return and impact. And ultimately, our ambition would be that over time, impact investing is no longer a discrete 1% of the investment world, but rather it becomes a standard part of the way we think about all investing. Because as a simple fact, every investment has an impact. It's a question of the degree of impact. Is it positive? Is it negative?
And it also it doesn't have to diminish what the return would be.
No, that's right.
Agree on it.
That's the second point of the RISE Fund and our effort there. And we're now, it was just in the
Can you just specify that?
Yeah, Anne's point, which is critical, is that the outcomes that we're talking about, measuring the social and environmental outcomes, which ultimately tie back to the Sustainable Development Goals, do not in any way compromise return. In fact, it's sort of an obvious point, but if the output of a business is that which is creating the impact, so I'm a healthcare provider, I'm a technology solution, I'm providing education, by definition, the more successful that company is, the more output they create, the more impact that is created. And what we've been able to demonstrate to date by looking at the both impact and financial returns that we're generating is that collinear relationship that Anne was just referring to is inherent. There's a collinear relationship there. And it gives you a lot of hope, because if you look at the $2.5 trillion a year gap today that exists in the Sustainable Development Goals, we're not going to get there with philanthropy and government alone. There just aren't enough taxes and aren't enough philanthropies. The Gates Foundation is less than 1.5% of the first year's gap that exists in the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we need is to activate the $200 trillion that's currently active in the investable universe, corporate balance sheets, and direct those dollars against achieving these outcomes, which can only be done, to your question, if we measure them. Yeah. If we can actually create a third-party, accountable measurement solution. So that's what we've set out to do. Mary Ann Hancock's here in the room, who's CEO of our RISE Labs, which we've set up as a separate separate entity, public benefit corporation, to do this for everybody, because ultimately the bane of our existence as a human race is our inability to measure externalities. And to the extent we can get to a place where we collectively, across government, philanthropy, and the investing world, can agree on how to measure these externalities in a quantifiable, rigorous way, it will truly be transformative, I think, in the way the private sector and in general capital gets allocated.
Mm. And in doing so, you will measure the negative as well as the positive.
Negative as well as positive. It's critical.
Right.
You have to give a net. We have to understand a net number, and
right.
and ultimately every business has a combination of positive and negative externalities.
So, as applied to returns, if I move that to my GDP,
yep.
It's a little bit, what you're saying is that if we were to measure properly and include both positive and negative externalities to GDP, it would probably mean that GDP would increase.
Well, totally. It's a totally different, you know, if you look at the way we allocate capital as a society, you see different numbers, but roughly 65% of all healthcare dollars in the United States are committed to the last 6 months of life.
Yeah.
What's the return on that investment relative to our investing against early childhood education, a smart grid, climate, growth infrastructure? It's a fascinating question. We don't ever think that way. And these investment allocations are left to politics and religion. It would be fascinating to imagine how we would all react if we simply looked at the relative good of these different choices that we're making in a way that was truly credible, third-party, rigorous, which is the key to all of this, that it not be a tummy rub, which is what it's been historically, but instead that it be founded in rigor.
A tummy rub?
A tummy rub.
Yeah, okay.
That's a California colloquialism.
Okay, forgive the foreigner that I am sometimes. And you wanted to...
I would just add to what Bill is saying. However, the return is not always going to be a market return. However, if you can get a group of people in, financial institutions in, where we in aggregate can agree on what the return is going to be. Obviously, if you have a Rockefeller Foundation, the return they're looking for is what was the impact, not the money. Development bank is very patient money. Commercial bank will accept low return, they just look for a lower risk. And then you move up, family offices, wealthy individuals who can come together and believe in a particular subject. They want some return, but they may agree on something within their portfolio that looks like a fixed income, which would be 3 or 4%. And then you have private equity.
Which is egregious returns.
But market returns. We have done this, and it works.
How do you bring people together and get them to agree? Because some of them have to concede, some of them have to compromise,
yes. Some
of them have to take a longer-term approach. How do you do that?
You show them some successes, and I think success begets more success.
And I think this point, and Anne was a pioneer in this area too, when you talk about impact in a quantified way, right. That allows you to make these trade-offs. When you can start saying, look, for every dollar we invest in the RISE Fund, we're delivering you a 12 times multiple of money on measurable, auditable, reportable impact.
And prove it.
And it's proven. It's not our word, it's third party. People can start making interesting trade-offs of where they choose to allocate their capital, because most of the capital in the world is sitting in bank accounts, uninvested, unused, doing nothing for the world. And it creates an interesting imperative when you see the correlation of impact and social outcomes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to close with you, Sunil, because you just recently pledged to donate $1 billion. And clearly you're one of those essential contributors from the private sector and from your own personal pocket. You decided to focus on education, and education in the poorest of the poor countries. And you are particularly keen to make sure that girls in particular have access to education. So tell us a little bit about that project of yours, and then we'll close this session because I'm told that I'm winked at.
Well, you know, all of us entrepreneurs get inspired from success of others and what they do. And when you do well, you are asked to write a lot of checks. And we decided what we do best is organize projects, run projects, manage projects. So rather than just writing checks, let's pick up one subject in which we go all in. We saw Bill Gates going in for fighting diseases, and many others have done different programs. We picked up education because of its impact to be a multiplier in a society, especially India, where there are very young children. I mean, India is a very young nation, and villages don't have access to school. Even if there are schools, they're not working. We decided, therefore, to go and build schools. We have built 270 schools, primary schools. Now the program of secondary schools are building up. And by the time the children start to come out of secondary schools, we want a university to be ready, and that's the big grant we've done now.
But you said that technology is the key, and you don't need to build anymore. So,
yeah. So you're right. But within those, you have to still get community going. And these schools are not fancy schools. They're basic schools in villages, and not
to learn to read, right?
Yeah. Also, it's also you can do a lot of teaching through digital technology now, and we are supporting it. IBM is a part of the program. Google is a part of the program. But you need to get children in. And these are little 5-year-old kids coming into school. They need to just get going first. And these are primary schools mainly. 300,000 very little poor children, mostly girls, are in these schools. They take away technology as they grow older. They start to use technology. But when you go into higher levels, India needs to generate its own brain power. I think we want to create a very high-quality tech university, which will again be a different university where you're not just rotating in the classes, but you're doing a lot of technological interventions. You could be sitting under trees and cafes, and you could keep on doing your stuff on tablets and all. That is the vision of our new university. We have got tremendous support from the American leading institutes, which we very much admire. And hopefully we would have made a small difference in our countries that we operate.
But you also operate in sub-Saharan Africa.
Absolutely.
It's India and sub-Saharan Africa.
And sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, to all our panel members, please, a big hand out.